Specs, if you will, inside the Sistine Chapel, there comes another powerful and quiet moment, if you will, when they're taken, the new Pope is taken into the so-called Room of Tears. And we have seen the images in years past, and certainly the images leading up to this conclave, of the cassocks hanging there in the Room of Tears. They have three different sizes prepared, sort of a small, medium, and large. They have shoes gathered there as well. Again, in addition to choosing their name, they choose how they're going to present themselves to the faithful just moments from now.
That's right, and it's changed over the years. Popes, up until when I was a young person, a child and a young person, they did dress more regally. They had the red cape and ermine, and Pope Benedict XVI brought some of that back. Famously, Pope Francis did not. He didn't take the red shoes, which are supposed to represent the blood of the martyrs that are there for him to wear. He kept his ordinary black tie-up shoes, and I think it's apocryphal, but he's supposed to have said, when offered some of the finery, he's supposed to have said, no, no, not for me. The carnival is over. Now, whether he actually said that, I think, is in dispute, but it was reflective of the change that he wanted to make. To bring the papacy down from on high, it was a temporal power for many centuries. They ruled much of Europe and had a kingly bearing. And I think in the 21st century, the way to reach people is probably not by awing them into obedience or faith, but by accompanying them, that Franciscan word that he used so often. And at the end of the day, part of it, the simplicity of his dress communicated, I'm closer to you than someone who is trying to be a king or kingly. And it'll be interesting to see what they wear.
It'll be very interesting, and it might sound small to some people, the choice of shoes or the simplicity beyond that cassock, but it speaks volumes, especially in those first moments when the new Pope is introduced to the world. And Lindsay, there was a story that Pope Francis had shared along the way that after being named Pope, the words of one of his peers in those quiet moments rang loudly in his own mind about don't forget the poor, which is, he said, when that moment appeared to him, that I'll go by Francis, St. Francis of Assisi, who was so focused on the poor and the people at the margins.
Certainly a champion of the poor, as we saw the same with St. Francis himself. It's often that the Pope does rely on someone that they want to revere or honor, be that a saint or be that a previous Pope, and we'll likely see that just in a few moments. One thing I was noticing as we look at the crowd is all the different flags that you see. Brazil, Canada, France, America, Germany, Spain, Argentina. There is such a connection for millions to this centuries-old tradition. And another thing, when we talk about hope with the new Pope, if we look at the church in general, religion is on a decline globally, and so this is a really unifying time.
It is, and as you say, it is a global moment here at St. Peter's Square. You can see it both in the flags and in the symbolism that we're witnessing right now. Swiss Guard now marching here at St. Peter's Square. We're also joined by Father John Walk, an ABC News contributor. And Father Walk, talk us through what we're witnessing right now, and from what history tells us, how long will it be for viewers back home in the U.S. watching before we actually see the new Pope emerge?
It shouldn't be much more than, say, 40 minutes from now. I think when the Pope will appear on what's called the loggia of St. Peter's, which is right on top of a relief that shows Jesus Christ giving the keys that he promised to Peter. And we're witnessing that transfer, not from Christ to Peter, but from one Pope to the next. That's the transfer that's been going on for 2,000 years. The keys of the kingdom are being passed on to the next successor of Peter. And in the square, what we're seeing is, I think, a very graphic example of how all roads lead to Rome. You mentioned all the flags that you see, the internationality of the crowd, but also the streets of Rome are filling with people pouring out of their homes and their offices and the hotels to make their way to St. Peter's Square. It's becoming a river of humanity towards St. Peter's Square.
A river of humanity, well put, Father. And I want to ask you about that moment inside the Sistine Chapel when a cardinal is asked, do you accept your election as Supreme Pontiff? Obviously the answer is yes. And then the question is what name you wish to be called. Pope John Paul II accepted his election, saying, with obedience and faith to Christ my Lord, and with trust in the Mother of Christ and the Church, in spite of great difficulties, I accept. In that moment, signaling that he recognized the weight of the role he was about to take on.
Right. It's obviously an enormous weight on the shoulders of the future pope. And I think it's also important as we see the crowd and the cheerfulness of the crowd to think of the church as a family. It's a family of 1.4 billion people, and they've elected a father, and yet they don't know who the father is. I think we're accustomed to families awaiting the arrival of a child, but in this case we have a gigantic family awaiting, you could say, the arrival of a dad, who they will be called to love and honor and respect and to treat as a father. And that's part of the weight that the new pope has to bear. He has to be a father for these people from all over the world, from different cultures and languages and experiences. He's going to be a paternal figure for a 1.4 billion people.
Father Walk, I wanted to ask you as well about the importance of the name and what that will signal very early on about the next pope. Francis had been sitting next to, you can hear the swell of the crowd. Let's just listen to the cheers of the crowd for a moment. I'll come back to this. Pope Francis had been sitting next to the Archbishop Emeritus of Sao Paulo, and he said when things started looking dangerous, in his words, according to Francis, when it was starting to look like it was going his way during the counting, Francis said the Brazilian embraced me, kissed me, and said, "Don't forget the poor." And Francis would later say those words came to me, the poor, pointing to his head. He said right away, thinking of the poor, I thought of Francis of Assisi. Then I thought of all of the wars as the votes were being counted. There was so much to look at across the world and think about, but it'll be so fascinating to hear the name and perhaps a little later on what this new pope is thinking about in these crucial moments before being introduced to the world, Father.
Yeah, as Father Martin said, we're going to hear three names. We're going to hear a first name, a last name, and then a name that no one knows except the cardinals now. Presumably they know what name he's chosen. And it's going to be a reflection, in part probably of personal devotion, a name perhaps of a saint that means something to the new pope, but also frequently a sense of history. John Paul I took the names of his two predecessors, John the 23rd and Paul VI, and put them together. It was a very strong sign of continuity. And John Paul II took the same name, John, as a sign of continuity as well. Benedict, I think, in part, he put the name Benedict as a sort of patron saint of Christian Europe. One of the founders of Christian Europe is the great monk, founder of Western monasticism, Saint Benedict. And Francis, as you say, took the name of Francis of Assisi. So we can read, probably, we don't know for sure, but a fair bit into the name that the new pope will take.
And of course, Father Walk, thank you for being here for the coverage, and stick with us here. A lot to witness here together in the coming minutes and hours here in Rome. Father Walk mentions the first name, the last name, and then obviously the name chosen as the new Pope of the Catholic Church. For Catholics watching all over the world, obviously the most important thing out of the gate is the first name and the last name, because they want to know, who is this Pope? Is it the one that perhaps a particular community or corner of the world has been rooting for, whether or not this would be history made here today, or have they chosen an Italian pope? Are they going to return to some of their historical roots? These are questions we simply do not have answered at this point. As Father Walk said, about 40 minutes or so from now, we should have the new pope standing there at the balcony. We know back in 2013, the white smoke appeared at about 7:06 in the evening. The bells began ringing about a minute later. Habemus Papam came at about 8:12, so it was an hour and 6 minutes or so after the smoke and the bells that we actually saw the new pope. So we will keep our cameras trained right there. You're not going to miss a moment of this. Liz Nagy of WLS in Chicago, also part of our team of ABC stations covering this as well. And Liz, I know you've had a chance to talk with many people, Americans and others who have gathered here at the Vatican to witness history. What are they telling you?
David.
We'll come back to Liz in just a moment, as you can imagine, with the cameras and the eyes of the world on the Vatican communications, and perhaps it's just the really tight security with the Sistine Chapel. They swept the chapel and they jammed communications in some parts of the Vatican, and obviously they do that with every conclave to prevent there from being any communication with the cardinals who are inside that room. No newspapers, no television, no cell phones. They gave up the cell phones well before they went into that conclave. Let's go back down to James Longman. He's right in St. Peter's Square. And James, we've been watching the live pictures here, and you're seeing it right behind you, the swelling of this crowd growing in numbers as they wait to meet the new Pope.
Yeah, I've got to tell you, David, what a thrill when that white smoke went into the air. People were screaming, not just because they're seeing white smoke, but because I don't think anybody expected it to come this early. And let's face it, it is early, given how many electors there are, 133. We just did not expect it to come at this time. It feels like this group of men have wanted to give us certainty in a time of great uncertainty. I think this early vote, they want us to show how united they are, because we've spent the last few days talking about how different all these cardinals are. And they're showing the world that no, we're on the same page, we are a family, as John Walk said. Just behind me, we just watched the marching band come through. Vatican City is, of course, a state. It has a military, the Swiss Guard. They came through in their marching dress, their formal attire. They marched past us there, and they've gone down. They're still filing up to the balcony, just underneath the balcony there in front of St. Peter's Basilica, because, of course, this Pope is not just the leader of 1.4 billion Catholics, but he's also head of state. So they will stand to attention underneath that balcony, waiting for him to come out. But what an extraordinary moment for all these people who are flooding down. More and more and more of them. But the area behind me, they kept pretty thin for the last few days because they wanted to avoid a crush. Feels like they were saving the space, honestly. And now, no more space to save, because people want to get a front seat. And flags from all over the world. People are hoping their guy, maybe he's the one that they've chosen. And we had all kinds of different ideas of these different groups, right? Was it going to be a missionary pope? Was it going to be an administrator? Was it going to be a diplomat? Was it going to be one of the more kind of personable candidates? We simply did not know. An early decision like this, or let's say early, possibly this means Parolin. That's what a lot of people were saying, speculating certainly before conclave, that this many people, this many men, these many cardinals, if they were going to make a decision at this point, it might have meant that someone they knew, like Parolin, was going to be there. But of course, we have no idea.
Yeah, we certainly do not know. James brings up Parolin. For those of you at home watching in the States, that's Pietro Parolin, the Secretary of State chosen by Pope Francis to be the chief diplomat, if you will, and really to be at Pope Francis's side during his tenure as Pope. He is from Italy, he's 70, but of course he was just one of many contenders. There were several others from Italy. It wasn't believed that the Pope would be from the United States, given the fact that the U.S. Is a superpower in the world, already has significant influence. The church has shied away from that in the past, but who knows? There could be a surprise awaiting the world here today. The surprise could come in the form of a pope that comes from elsewhere in the world, one of the corners of the world that Pope Francis was so determined, Lindsay, to bring into the church.
And what will be so fascinating, because as you talk about, he had appointed more cardinals to the College of Cardinals outside of Europe than any of his predecessors. But what will be interesting to see, as we've been banding about, really, the name that they will choose. And just a little tidbit for the cocktail party. The first pope to change his name was John II back in 533, and that was because his birth name was Mercury. That was considered to be inappropriate for him to be named Mercury as pope because it's the name of a pagan god. And just some fun facts there. John has been the most popular name, chosen 23 times, Gregory 16 times, Benedict 16 times. The only name that we will not hear called today is Peter, because that is basically an unwritten rule that the one pope that Jesus chose himself will not actually be carried on in a subsequent pope.
So no Peter, but perhaps one of the other names that you mentioned, perhaps will surprise us and go their own way like Pope Francis did. As you look at the live pictures of not only the band marching, the Swiss Guard, you also see the balcony there, the eyes of the world on that balcony, where we will hear not only, as Father Walk pointed out, the first name, the last name, but the chosen name of the cardinal inside the Sistine Chapel, who is now the Pope of the Catholic Church. You know, the moment they accept, I mentioned that question earlier, do you accept your election to Supreme Pontiff? The moment they say yes, they are the Pope of the Catholic Church. So it's a relatively small window of about an hour's time that they have privacy from the rest of the world in a role larger than life, if you will, where we will get to know who they are in just moments. You can hear the band performing. The new Pope, as I mentioned before in this interim, goes to the room of tears where the white papal vestments await, multiple sizes at the ready, the shoes. And again, we mentioned Pope Francis, Pope John Paul II didn't go with some of the shoes that had been presented, chose simple black leather shoes that they wore throughout their papacy. The Carmelengo places the ring of the fourth finger of the Pope's right hand, kneels and kisses that ring, actually. That is also playing out. Then the Carmelengo, then each of the cardinals approaches the new Pope, as we mentioned. They kneel before him in an act of obedience to pay their respects, to wish the Pope well. And it's extraordinary to think that they were sitting in the room with the Pope having lunch just a few hours ago. The cardinal at that point did not know that he would become Pope. When you think about it in those terms, Father Martin, it's quite extraordinary, right? I mean, they don't get to talk during the election itself when they're in the Sistine Chapel, but during the lunches and during dinners, they can lean on one another. They can ask questions. Well, what do you think about the cardinal at the top of the list getting the most votes so far? There isn't, strong-arming, the sort of politicking that we're used to back in the United States, but there is a fair amount of campaigning that we just never get to witness ourselves. But to think they were just having lunch together with the person who would become Pope just about an hour or two later.
It is amazing, and what we call in the church the grace of office comes upon someone, which is we believe that the Holy Spirit gives the person the grace and the ability and the capability to carry out the office. And a number of popes have written and have said that after they accept, they feel differently. They feel a sense of kind of freedom and a sense of sort of inspiration. I think it's also important to look at it from a spiritual point of view. Catholics believe this is the successor of St. Peter. It's an unbroken line from Peter to whoever the new pope is. And also a small thing, Catholics around the world, if you go to Mass every Sunday, you will hear this person's name in the Eucharistic prayer now. So back in New York, it was Francis, our Pope, Timothy, our Bishop, and now Catholics everywhere are going to hear every Sunday the name that we still don't know, which is very exciting.
Behind closed doors right now, the new Pope already beginning his duties. He'll actually lead the cardinals in Te Deum, and he'll give him his benediction. And of course, Te Deum is giving thanks.
Yeah, it's a traditional and ancient prayer of giving thanks to God. Certainly they've been asking for the help of the Holy Spirit. They've received the Holy Spirit now, and very quickly. And so it's appropriate that they will give thanks to God. And I think they are probably just as excited as we are, to give their obedience to their new spiritual leader.
The new Pope, after giving his benediction, is then led down the Hall of Blessings to that central window. You can see the cameras, and it's not just ours, the cameras of the world are trained on this balcony. The Pope is led down the Hall of Blessings to that central window of St. Peter's Basilica, where tens of thousands have gathered in the square. I can't wait for you to hear this swell of applause when they see the Pope emerge on that balcony. We believe that it'll be Cardinal Protodeacon Dominique Momberti of France who will announce to the world the name of the new Pope. After that, Cardinal Momberti goes back inside St. Peter's. The balcony will be prepped for the new Pope's appearance. Then the new Pope appears on the balcony sometime after that announcement, greets the crowd, and delivers the apostolic blessing, really to the city and to the world watching this moment. Father Walk, it's really impossible for any of us to understand what it must feel like for the new Pope to walk down the Hall of Blessings, to think about it in terms of how they will address the faithful and really the world for the first time, and what's most appropriate for the message they want to send.
Yeah, one of the traditions the popes have observed is when they come out of the Sistine Chapel, before going to the balcony where they're going to give the blessing from St. Peter's facade, they stop in the Pauline Chapel where the cardinals gathered before the conclave. And in that chapel, he's going to be facing the fresco by Michelangelo of the crucifixion of the first pope, of Peter being crucified upside down. You think that's the first thing that he sees as he's about to face the world, the first pope giving his life in fidelity to Jesus Christ. And it's a reminder that the Good Shepherd, right? Christ is the Good Shepherd, and he lays down his life for his sheep. And that's what the Pope is being called to do, is being called to give his life entirely to the people he's about to be introduced to and discover, as I was saying earlier, as his children. He's about to see, all of a sudden, I am the father of this massive crowd in the square of people from all over the world.
It's been about 39 minutes now, Father Walk, since we saw that white smoke and the ringing of the bells. We know from recent conclaves it's about an hour, a little more than an hour sometimes. They could surprise us by coming to us a little earlier with the new Pope. But Father Walk, I'm curious what you think, and I know it's very hard to speculate, but what you think about this coming after the fourth ballot. You know, there was so much talk about 133 cardinals, more than we have seen in modern times, that they come from all over the world, that many had not met each other, didn't know each other very well. There was some who believed that meant we could be here for a little while longer, but instead what we've witnessed here is quite similar to what we saw with Pope Benedict and then with Pope Francis on the fourth and fifth ballots, having a decision so soon.
Yeah, it's a little bit surprising, but I think we're gonna hear different hypotheses about how it turned out this way. But it may, in fact, be that the very fact that there were people who were from so many different places, 133 cardinals who didn't necessarily know each other, actually ended up limiting the choices, right? And so that they were actually had to focus on a fairly small number of possible candidates. And that may have made it, in a way, easier, because by limiting the possibilities to a select few that were better known, it made it easier for them to choose a pope in a relatively short period of time.
I know there are a lot of people trying to figure out what the timing means, Father Walk. Does it mean they continue down a path that Pope Francis began? Does it mean they tried to find someone who's a centrist, who can reach out in a very human way like Pope Francis did, but also be somewhat safer for the traditionalists, the more conservative wing of the Catholic Church? You want to weigh in on what the timing of this might signal?
I don't think that the timing is going to tell us the answer to those questions. And I think in terms of the route that the Pope will take, it's going to be hard to know immediately, because the different areas of the church, I mean, the different parts of geographically, parts of the church, see those questions in different ways. What it means in Africa, what it means in Asia, what it means in Latin America and Europe and North America is not necessarily the same. And so to see it in terms of sort of right or left or progressive or conservative, it's going to be a little more complicated, I think. We have our sort of American or Western European ways of reading that, but the cardinals who elected the Pope may not see things quite in those terms.
I think you're absolutely right. It's far more nuanced than conservative or more progressive. And you talk about the geography involved, the new cardinals who were brought into the church by Pope Francis. We know that about 80% of the cardinals who were voting in the Sistine Chapel were actually chosen by Pope Francis. And of course, for those of you following our reporting the last few days, you heard us say this a number of times. You can only vote as a cardinal if you're under 80. In fact, one of the cardinals in the room, it's his 80th birthday next week. So we got into that very influential moment just in time before those doors closed, if you will, to play a significant role. Each one of those 133 cardinals playing a very important role at this turning point for the Catholic Church. Of course, one of them is now the Pope. One of the interesting things is you have to get a 2/3 majority, which means 89 votes inside the chapel. It can't be unanimous, because if it was a unanimous vote, if everyone chose the same person, that would mean one of the cardinals voted for themselves, which is not allowed, Father Martin, is it?
Not allowed, and also bad form, and also against humility. I think that they're very aware of the need for secrecy, following rules. This is an ancient tradition that has been laid down for generations, sort of revised a little bit by John Paul and by Benedict and Francis, but these cardinals are deeply aware of the solemnity and the gravity of this decision.
Now, as I understand it, Father Martin, the tallies of each one of these votes, and again, this could have been the 4th vote or the 5th vote. We believe it was the 4th, just giving the timing. We know there were 2 votes planned for this afternoon. Whether or not they needed both of them or not, we're going to find out here in the ensuing hours. It's our belief that it was just the 4th vote. But obviously, you had 3 cardinals in the front of that room who were chosen with each vote, and it's their job to read the ballots. They pass the ballot to the cardinal next to them, who then confirms the name, and then passes the cardinal next to them, who then reads the name aloud to the Sistine Chapel. The fellow cardinals then hear who has received a vote. It's then attached to a thread. All of the paper ballots are put on a single thread, and at the end of these voting sessions, they're then burned in the stove in the Sistine Chapel. So there's no actual record. The ballots aren't saved. The only record is the tally that they keep track of. In the separate stove is where they use the chemicals now, just to make sure that that smoke is clearly white or clearly black. And I have to say, we appreciate them for doing that today, because it can be nerve-wracking when you come on the air. In the beginning of the black smoke, it looks a little gray and you're just a little uncertain, but there was really no uncertainty with the white smoke that emerged just about 40 minutes or so now ago here at Vatican City. But Father Martin, it's my understanding that with each one of these votes, the numeric tally, which they keep a record of, is then sealed and handed to the new Pope. And it's up to the new Pope whether or not we learn what the numbers were in the coming months or years.
That's right. Sometimes the numbers have come out. Cardinals, or some people find out about it. But in the oath that they took just recently that we heard, they promised to keep it safe and keep it secure, as you said, David, unless the new Pope allows them to reveal it.
St. Peter holding the key there to the papacy, obviously extraordinarily symbolic in this moment. We'll have to wait and see how secretive these cardinals are. Just to get back to your point, Father Martin, because we did learn over time, and in fact, Pope Francis described the moment as he said things were starting to go a dangerous way, meaning his way. We do know that in 2013, when Pope Francis was elected, he had done well in the previous conclave with Pope Benedict, who was eventually named, but Pope Francis did very well in that conclave as far as the number of votes. But when he returned all those years later, he was older. He didn't think that, he thought his opportunity, his time, his moment had passed. He brought his suitcase and he had in his bag his return ticket, did he not?
That's right. And in 2005, earlier, the conclave that elected Pope Benedict, Pope Francis, or Jorge Mario Bergoglio, came in second, and he felt that he was being used by people to block Cardinal Ratzinger's move to becoming Pope. And so he asked his people, the people who were supporting him, to not support him any longer. But you're right, David. In 2013, he was seen, I think, widely as just too old.
But he wasn't, and he was in the papacy for a good number of years and had a tremendous influence, certainly with the cardinals that he appointed, and addressing many of the issues that do face the church, from finances to LGBTQ to the role of women in the church, the sex abuse scandal, which is not something unique to the United States. It's obviously an issue that they have had to deal with throughout the world. I want to bring in Liz Nagy of WLS. We mentioned she was with our coverage here earlier in the crowd, fighting the communication and the crush of media here. And hopefully we can hear you this time. Liz, what are folks telling you?
David, people are just absolutely thrilled to be here. There's frankly very little room left to move around in St. Peter's Square because there are tens of thousands of people who have rushed in over the last 45 minutes or so to see that Pope emerge on the balcony. And I'm struck that the diversity in this crowd out here really reflects the diversity of the College of Cardinals that was sitting in the Sistine Chapel. There's a person I'm not sure you can see propped up on a fence over there with a Brazilian flag wrapped around their shoulders. We've seen people walking around with Filipino rainbow flags, people chanting the names of their countries, but also you can see people greeting complete strangers. This is really a moment of celebration, not just for Catholics of the world, but for people who are here in Rome. I'm also struck by the number of young people who are here. We've spoken to a lot of students this week who've been studying abroad in Rome and just happen to be lucky enough to be here during this experience. Some who say they've been moved to get more in touch with their spirituality because of all of this. There are children propped on the shoulders of their parents, and everybody's doing sort of exactly what we're doing right now, staring into the sun, trying to crane their neck and see who is going to emerge on the balcony. And because of the time of day and the westward-facing direction of St. Peter's Square, it's a little difficult, but nevertheless, people are thrilled to see who will come out there. There was one priest who just walked by a few minutes ago. I said, do you know who is going to step out on that balcony? And he said, of course, the Pope. So for Catholics who we've spoken to this week, they say it really doesn't matter who that person is. The Catholic Church is universal, and this will be their leader. David?